Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Truth. I'm your host, the one you love the most, Niall Hassan, back with a brand new episode here in The Truth. Back once again with my boy, AJ Ponciano. AJ, how are you doing here today?
I'm doing great.
How about yourself, Niall?
I'm doing great as well. We are transitioning over to our Thursday night special where we will give you guys our must starts, sits, sleepers, and busts for week 5 in the NFL here for Thursday night. An intriguing matchup, an NFC South matchup. I wonder if you'll be watching this matchup in particular as the Bucks travel to Atlanta to take on the Falcons. No Saints. We got 2 of the 4 teams in the NFC South competing here today. Should be a fun game. Obviously, the Buccaneers and Falcons, interesting seasons to say the least, some interesting star players and guys that haven't been performing well. So we'll hopefully give you guys start, sit, sleepers, and busts. I feel like this is a matchup in particular where it's a little harder to differentiate some of the guys, and we're really able to kind of differentiate them into different categories as opposed to like having the Chiefs who we know like Mahomes is a start or Pacheco's a start or Kelsey's a start. Like this is a matchup where I feel like there's some guys that you can put in the start, sit, sleepers, and busts just because I feel like a lot of them have been average besides a couple of people. So without further ado, go ahead and give me any starts that you may have this week for Thursday night.
I got to go with Bucky Irving. I called Bucky Irving early on that there's a chance that he could be the RB1 in this backfield. And at this point, I think he only has a few less carries. Yeah, he only has 6 less carries, but right around 90 more yards. He has 203 rushing yards to Rashad White's 115. He also has a rushing touchdown, who, outside Baker Mayfield, has the only rushing touchdown. Baker has 2. On the receiving side, yeah, he's not going to give you the receiving production as Rashad White. Rashad White has 14 receptions for 133, but he has 6 receptions uh, on 8 targets for 34 yards. I mean, he last week was a sign of it. He, I believe, out carried Rashad White, had more yards. Just kind of seems like the trend is going to go on, and it was like how we were just both talking about how, but we both may have really bad weeks because of fantasy. I know you have Bucky Irving on your dynasty league, and with a lot of buys this week, I know the Lions have a buy. It's a big one there. I'm losing Montgomery and Gibbs in one of my leagues where I stack them. Saquon and the Eagles, I believe they have a bye week. You're going to lose them. I want to say the Packers also have a bye week. So if you have Josh Jacobs, he's another guy
They don't.
that they don't have a bye week. Oh, they may
Sorry to
lose this.
discredit you there. I just wanted to throw that out there. No, because
Okay,
I the only reason why I know that is because one of my starts for this week is on the Packers, and I
got you.
wanted to just mention that out there. But yeah, well, as you mentioned, I'll let you continue with your point here in a second. But yeah, we've officially transitioned to the point where there's bye weeks. And the 4 teams that are on a bye week this week are the Lions, Chargers, Eagles, and the Titans.
Yeah, so I guess with the Titans, Spears and Pollard are the only guys that are out, but I don't know how many people are starting those two. And then Dobbins, J.K. Dobbins, there with the Chargers, and a lot of people are relying on him. He's had a bad week last week and is kind of on the downslope right now from his really hot start. But Bucky Irving, he's a guy you can go through. You put in your RB2 slot or your flex spot if you really need someone. Plus, individual matchup. I mean, we saw it last week with the Saints. Yeah, they didn't put up a lot of points against this Falcons defense. I believe they only put up 24 or whatever it was. But one of the things, there was a lot of yards in that game, and that's all you really care about. Obviously, you want your touchdowns, but like guys like Bucky Irving, he's giving you a lot of yards. That's all you really care about at the end of the day. Guy you're able to plug and play. And then with that is Baker Mayfield. I get it. This pass defense has been solid for the Falcons uh, against Hurts. They only allowed 179 yards against Kansas City. 127 or 217, and then 235 to Derek Carr last week. I'm not counting the Steelers game there with Justin Fields hit 133. But either way, I mean, this last week, Baker showed off the rushing upside, but he had 2 rushing touchdowns last week, and this offense is really starting to move. Interdivisional game, they're going to want to be able to assert their dominance, especially with the Bucks being 3-1 and the Falcons being 2-2 right now. They want to extend that lead. I think that goes through Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, so for me, the first one, I actually have 2 starts this week, and they're actually both on the Falcons. The first one's going to be Kirk Cousins. I got to give my guy some credit. He has not had the season whatsoever. I mean, it's been a really bad year for him, transitioning from a torn Achilles to a new team. It just hasn't been a good fit for him. But I feel like there's one of these weeks coming up where he's going to really boom, and I think this is the potential for it to be. Obviously, the Falcons have had an interesting season to say the least. They are currently on the third and final game of their 3-game homestand, starting 4 of their first 5 at home. So they're going to be going on the road pretty soon here. Kirk's going to want to put out a good show for his fans before obviously venturing across to different areas. But all in all, I'm more expecting this to be the big Kirk Cousins breakout game. Now, by breakout game, do I mean scoring 30 some fantasy points? No. I think he for sure gets over 17, 18, probably in the 20s range, and kind of gets back to his fantasy relevancy that he had the last couple of seasons with Minnesota. I understand it takes time with a new offense. I understand they got a far superior running back and running backs that matter in Bijan and Tyler Algier than in recent years with Minnesota that they've ever had. So it's one of those things that it's been difficult for him in an adjustment as a whole. But I really think as time goes on here, Kirk Cousins is going to be in a pretty solid position nonetheless. And I think it starts off this week. And then secondly, I'm going to go with Darnell Mooney. Obviously, interesting career for Darnell Mooney, and especially an interesting year for Darnell Mooney as of late. Was completely irrelevant in week 1, but week 2 and week 3 kind of got his fantasy relevancy back. Week 4, 3 catches for 56 yards against the Saints, 8.6 fantasy points, which honestly, you compare that with some of the other receivers. I think Tyreek Hill had basically the same. I mean, he's got somewhat of a role, and there's been an emphasis from Kirk Cousins to get Darnell Mooney the ball. And let's not forget, Darnell Mooney is a very talented wide receiver. I was surprised he didn't really pan out in Chicago. He's got all the tools you need to be a successful wide receiver, and he kind of serves as that number 3 wide receiver, kind of sleepish wide receiver 3, even wide receiver 4 if you factor in guys like Bijan in the backfield. But all in all, I think Darnell Mooney's a start. It's kind of a low end start, which means there is some risk involved. So I probably would feel safer putting him as a sleeper position. But regardless, my sleeper guys are guys that I would plan on starting, particularly in deeper leagues. I think he can get back to that relevancy he had in weeks 2 and 3, which could propel him to some tremendous fantasy value. With Darnell Mooney, there is obviously risk in starting him, but I think the risk definitely I should say the rewards with the risk outroared any negative things that could come from this matchup here. Okay, what about sits?
So I only have one sit, and it's gonna be Kyle Pitts. Last week put up a big old goose egg, put up 0 points last week, and I don't expect him to do a whole lot this week, especially against the Bucks defense, who's been solid against tight ends. I know Zach Ertz isn't the tight end he used to be, but he's been pretty productive this year. They couldn't get him going in week 1. Week 2 against the Lions, Sam Laporta non-existent. Adam Trotman and the Broncos in a game that they lost, I think had one catch for like 14 yards. And then Dallas Goedert, yes, he did finish the game as the leading receiver, 7 receptions, 62 yards. But that was in a game where it was a blowout and they were just throwing the ball a lot more than I think they were expecting to. That was also a game with no A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, which took out really any option for Jalen Hurts to go to. Is really only Dallas Goedert. Now that Kirk Cousins obviously has other options, as you mentioned, Mooney, Kyle Pitts, Ray McLeod, Bijan Robinson, all great receiving threats. I think Kyle Pitts is kind of stacking up at the bottom of that list right now. But also, if you look at Kyle Pitts' numbers this year, it isn't good. I know I mentioned no receptions, no yards, but he hasn't gone over 60 yards. He has 2 receptions, 59, 3 receptions for 20, 3 receptions for 26 with a touchdown that game against Pittsburgh. That's all he's done this year. He hasn't had many targets either. He hasn't had more than 5 targets. His target share went from 3, 4, 5, and 3. It's not like he's a big part of this offense. And I do expect him to get the ball a couple times in the first drive, or a couple of drives, because I know their head coach came out and talked about like how he doesn't care about fantasy and Kyle Pitts did his job. But there's got to be some part of that where they're like, all right, we got to get Kyle Pitts involved a little bit. And maybe that is early on. Maybe he finishes the game with 3 to 4 receptions for 40 yards. But he's a guy I can't trust. A guy who was the 4th overall pick and he hasn't had any good target share with finally a good quarterback in his life there in Atlanta. I mean, it's one of those things that this was, in my opinion, his final year to prove that he could be a top tight end, and has not even come close to proving that.
So my first start I have 2. It's actually both ironically on the Buccaneers. Can you guys tell where I'm heading with this game matchup here? The first one's going to be Baker Mayfield. Look, Baker Mayfield, I understand he's the 3rd-ranked fantasy position quarterback right now, and I probably have some bitterness because I finally bit the bullet and started him in week 3 where he had 8.5 points. Week 2 was their only road matchup of the year, and in that road matchup, he only passed the ball 19 times. They did have a heavy focus on running the football. You take away his rushing touchdown value in that game, he gets back to that under 10 ratio for the most part. as far as fantasy is concerned. So historically, Baker Mayfield hasn't fared well in road matchups. It also is very difficult to play on the road, so I'm not discrediting Baker Mayfield whatsoever. I'm just saying you got to factor that in. His two of his three starts at home have been tremendous. Obviously, week one against the Commanders and last week against Philadelphia, but on the road, the Buccaneers definitely like to run the football a lot more, especially when they got two really solid backs in Rashad White and um, Bucky Irving. So looking at the Bucks from that perspective, I don't think it's going to be a high scoring game. I think one side's going to succeed and the other side's not. I'm definitely fading the Buccaneers side just because they're going into a difficult environment in Atlanta, an interdivisional matchup, what makes it that much more significant, as well as going back on the road after playing the last two games at home and beating a decently good Philadelphia Eagles team. There could be kind of a hangover effect there. And secondly, I'm going to go with Cade Otton. Now, Cade Otton for the Buccaneers has been disappointing. I was expecting a little bit more production. I've seen it recently in the past couple of weeks. Week 3 had 7 catches for 47 yards, equating to 9.7 points. In week 4, he had 6 catches for 52 yards, equating to 11.2 points. So, in the grand scheme of things with these 2 weeks, you got to feel positive. The areas of concern: week 1 reception, 5 yards. The lone game on the road in week 2 at Detroit: 0 catches for 0 yards, 1 carry for -4 yards. So -4 fantasy points in his one road game this season. This obviously contributes to Baker Mayfield not throwing the ball as expected or as much as maybe people were thinking that he was going to. So it's one of those things that's difficult. I think it's a difficult role environment for him. I also think that Mike Evans finally was able to get going, so you got a 1-2 punch there in Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, with a couple other receivers that can factor in, especially the running backs that seem to have a very deep pass value as well. I feel like the tight end position is an important position, but in Tampa Bay, it doesn't seem to be, particularly on the road, particularly going into a divisional matchup in Atlanta. Okay, what about sleepers? Yeah, so I'll continue at that point. My first sleeper is Ray McLeod. Look, we obviously saw in week 1, I mean, nobody was really had any expectations for Ray McLeod going into the season. Week 1 wasn't phenomenal, but phenomenal from the least amount of expectations expecting out of a guy like McLeod. 4 catches for 52 yards, 9.2 fantasy points. His following week, 7.5, 5.7, and last week had his highest fantasy point value of the season with 11.2, totaling 6 receptions for 52 yards. There's a good chance that Ray McLeod finds the end zone, especially if I'm kind of banking on the fact that Kirk Cousins is going to have a good game. Yeah, there's some really good options at the wide receiver position, but as you mentioned, he's even higher than Darnell Mooney, who I'm very much higher on. It seems to be as well that he's kind of filtered himself in a mix here with a very talented young offense in Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson, and even Tyler Algier. So Ray McLeod, although there is some overlap because it's a Thursday night game, he is definitely one of those guys that you can't overlook. He's a guy that, I would seriously consider a deep sleeper for a weekly fantasy week. Not the fact that it's Thursday night, but all in all, again, Ray McLeod, maybe he has a potential to get his first touchdown this season. I always talk about just Thursday night, a lot of weird stuff happens. He's a guy that could definitely get into the end zone. He's a guy that could get you 15, 16 fantasy points, and he's a guy that's not rostered in very many leagues, only 3.5%. And even if you have a deep league, like a 7 bench spot league or a 14, 16 team league, make sure you get a guy like Ray McLeod, because this is a guy that could be a difference maker towards the end of your season and as your postseason run continues. And then my second sleeper, a guy that you've already talked about, it's Bucky Irving. I drafted Bucky Irving, as you mentioned, in my Dynasty League, not really with the expectation that he was going to be impactful this year, but mainly next year. And I feel like each week as they progress further and further, they've used less of Rashad White and more of Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving seriously has potential to just completely take over this Buccaneers running back one job. Former fourth round pick out of Oregon, they obviously have super high expectations for him. And that's saying something because Rashad White's coming off a tremendous season for the Buccaneers. So they have a really good 1-2 punch going. Baker obviously likes throwing to his running backs. Bucky Irving, every time I see him rush as well, seems to find the open hole, attack the gap, and have success there as well. So there's a lot of things going in his direction that could help prove to be very successful for his career moving forward. I think in this matchup, it's a particularly interesting matchup as well because in the past, Baker Mayfield has really tended to throw to his running backs, particularly when he doesn't have tremendous games. And this could be one of those games, especially if I'm leaning towards, Baker not being a successful player this week. So there is some things to take notice of. I think Rashad White and Bucky Irving are kind of neck and neck right now. It feels like a Montgomery Gibbs situation, which you don't really know who's going to be in at what time. But regardless, he's a guy that could be a sleeper and a guy that some people are starting to utilize more in their leagues, especially in those 14, 16 teamer leagues that are looking for that kind of low budget guy that could have profound impactful performances moving forward. Okay, then any busts. Okay, well, that was kind of weird. Our recording kind of spat out, and I don't really know where I left off. But at that point, I was kind of talking a lot about Bucky Irving, and AJ already mentioned Bucky Irving a lot. So, the grand scheme of things, I think Bucky Irving's a perfect fit for this matchup here, especially if I'm projecting Baker to not be as successful. Final thing here, actually, second final thing. Give me any busts that you may have.
So I have two, and it's kind of a two-parter in London and Cousins. And I get it; they both may have a solid game here, but if you look at this Buccaneers defense at this point, they've consistently give up basically 130 yards on the ground. But they've only really had one big game where they let up 324 yards in the air, and that was against the Lions. And really a pretty shootout game, more high scoring game. I don't think, or not high scoring, but high offense game. They were going back and forth. Didn't really end in a lot of points there, but ended up in a lot of yards. I think this game could be very low scoring and a lot of short drives. They have two games under 200 yards given up at 161 and 114 last week, and then 216. I just don't expect Kirk Cousins to have a big game. He's looked a little bit more comfortable these past few weeks. Having his legs underneath it feels like he actually trusts the Achilles now and be able to move a little bit more. But Drake London, it seems like it's either a big game or it's a bad game. It's one of the two. And I think Drake London, him and Bijan are going to be the main focus on this team. That's why I really like your pick of Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod. I think those two will be the main guys getting a lot of targets there. I think they're really going to hone in on Bijan and Drake London, and it's going to take away from, Drake London and Kirk Cousins. I think Kirk Cousins is going to have to settle for their underneath routes. Like I said, I think of a lot of short drives here. They're going to have to settle going to Darnell Mooney most of the game and Ray McLeod. I think they'll have success, especially in PPR leagues, but I don't expect them to have a huge offensive explosion game.
So my bust that I have this week is going to be Trey Palmer. I mean, Trey Palmer, the biggest thing with him, obviously, the 11.6 fantasy points last week. Okay, that was a once in a blue moon type thing. 3 catches, 26 yards, and a touchdown. The offense was absolutely rolling. Had only one reception, and that was in week 1 against Washington. One reception for 19 yards, 2.9 fantasy points. So, biggest thing, it was spotty. It's going to happen, but I just kind of wanted to mention out there as a bust. I don't really think he's going to be doing too much, to say the least, in this matchup here, especially if Baker's struggling. Okay, what about a game prediction?
So I really don't want any of these teams to win, but I would prefer the Bucks to win because they already have the division lead, and the Saints and Falcons are tied. So a little more biased pick. But like I said, I don't think it's going to be a high scoring game. I think 20-14 is going to be the final score there, with the Buccaneers winning.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the Falcons winning this game. I don't think it's going to be ridiculously high as well. I think I'm going to go 24 to like 13 Atlanta. I think just because Atlanta's at home, they're going to have a distinct advantage, but it should be a fun NFC South matchup to say the least. Thank you guys for listening to another episode here on The Truth. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure you follow The Truth on Twitter at The Truth as one to stay up to date with the latest information regarding The Truth, including podcast dates, podcast uploads, and other important information you don't want to miss. Make sure you guys also follow The Truth on Instagram and TikTok at the.tt.truth. Are you looking to find a drink that offers peak hydration, raises your energy levels, speeds up your recovery, and keeps your mind sharp to focus and memory? Look no further than Acid Rainwater. I'm excited to partner with Bloodline Sports AZ and Acid Rainwater, which focuses on peak hydration and productivity while also maintaining an ecosystem-friendly product. Use code HESSON15, that's HESSON15 for 15% off every purchase. As always, I'm your host, one you love the most, Niall Hesson, joined once again by AJ Ponciano. Take care and good night.